You're such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but this case is the solved case of Dr. Death, how a neurosurgeon turned into a serial killer. Now, you believe when there is a sickness or an injury within you that the safest place you can be is in the hands of a doctor. That is until you hear this story. Now, no one expected a thing like this to ever happen, and maybe that's why it took so long to stop it. By the way, there's a podcast called Dr. Death that has like 6 or 7 episodes on this very case, and it is so extremely helpful. It even goes in depth with the different types of surgery if that's something you're more interested in, but I will link it down below. I also want to say it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you'd like to support me in doing so, all you have to do is make sure you're subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2010 in Texas, and Christopher Duntsch had just moved to Dallas, and this was actually for a job at a medical center called Baylor Plano, and he was 39 years old at this time. This was his first job out of school that was being actually in a hospital. You see, he had done research before for a few years before turning to neurosurgery, and this is where I normally like to go into depth about the victims and who they were, what made them who they were in the world beyond just being a victim. However, this is not a normal case, so we are going to be talking about it a little differently, but please still know that the victims are my #1 priority in any story. You see, Christopher was born in 1971 in Tennessee, where he graduated from a Christian school for high school, and he grew up in a pretty normal family. He had a physical therapist as a father and a teacher as a mother who often liked to stay home with the kids. It was a pretty average upbringing. In fact, no one could find anything, strange or out of the ordinary that he had gone through or that he had seen as a kid. It was pretty average, and he actually went on to attend medical school at the University of Tennessee. He would also go on to get a doctorate in microbiology at St. Jude. And to get into these prestigious schools for the medical field is a feat in itself. I mean, it's pretty incredible to be able to do so. It was said that Christopher had a hard time excelling in anything. He was pretty mediocre in the things he did, but when he tried, this medical field, it seemed as though he found something he was meant to do. Or did he? Was what he was meant to do being a doctor or being a killer? Because many would later refer to him as Dr. Death. He was starting his career in residency, where he had to work under full-fledged surgeons who knew what they were doing, and he would just assist them during this time, and he would be doing the surgeries under their watch. So everyone said that he was a great student at this time, that he was really able to do many different types of procedures, that he did them all the time. He was doing great in his program, and once he graduated, Christopher decided to go into research rather than going into hospitals to do the actual surgeries. He wanted to come up with ways to help in the medical program and to invent things that would help the doctors and the clients. And at this point, it was 2009, and Christopher's research facilities that he was working under actually started to go under and go bankrupt. So he had to find a new job. Now, he decided he didn't just want to do research anymore. He wanted to do neurosurgery. And that is when he would move to Texas, where he would basically start his own practice there and have to market himself and get new patients to do surgery so he could get paid for those things. However, like I told you, he had just come from school where he was always under the watchful eye of a proper surgeon who had years of experience. Now, how was this even happening? Because he would obviously have to go under different hospitals to have this practice. They would have to, send clients to him, the doctors would. There was just a lot more that went into it than him being able to say, I'm opening my practice and welcoming all of the clients. So how did all of them let this happen with this basically newbie surgeon working all on his own with very little experience? Well, his past was not something he was truthful about in the slightest, but we'll get to that a little later. It was a practice somebody already owned, but he was like his own boss. He would actually get fired after doing one surgery. And this was because that surgery had gone very wrong and the patient was not stable when he was done. He patched her up, sent her into the recovery room, and then he fled. He didn't tell anybody what had happened. He didn't ask for help from another doctor. He basically just left her there and went to Las Vegas. But now he needed a new job, and with his previous one not ending so well, with him being fired, he needed to get back on the right track in the medical field and have people trust him again. But how is he going to do this? Well, that is when the commercials started playing in Texas of a doctor who was the best in the area, who had clients that were willing to speak up for him and say that he changed their lives or he saved their lives. Christopher got on screen and said, he was the best surgeon in Texas and all of the surgeries he had done had gone better than expected. And just like all commercials, no one knew how wrong this really was. No one knew if it was the truth or if it was a scam. But for the people hurting and the people who wanted their pain to diminish, this sounded incredible. Previous coworkers were left with horrible impressions of him. They said he was always bragging about his abilities even though he was so new in the field, and he was talking to surgeons who had decades of experience who were just baffled by the fact that he thought he was incredible when he in fact botched the first surgery that he did there. But this is when he would get a job at an actual hospital called Baylor Plano that I told you about before. So it's a pretty big hospital, and at this point he would also invite his assistant, who, well, he actually had two. Now, he had a 5-month pregnant girlfriend who would come to Texas and start to live with him. He also brought an assistant named Kim, who was really his mistress, that he was lying to Wendy about, saying she was just his assistant. However, his real assistant was a man named Jerry Summers, who had been his best friend for years. Jerry was an extremely sweet, caring, and giving guy. He had a girlfriend that he had just gotten engaged to, who was the love of his life and was planning to actually move there with him as well. And he had a job he loved. He was in a perfect place in his life. The only problem was that he kind of had pain in his neck and his back and his shoulders because he had gotten into a sports accident when he was younger, and then a car accident a few years later, which had caused him some pain. And so when Christopher started hearing about this pain that Jerry was having, he offered to give him elective spinal fusion, which is something that's not necessary but can help with the pain. So Jerry, of course, was very excited about this. He was going to have his best friend work on him, someone he trusted. And so he went into surgery happy that day, but he woke up horrified. He had barely made it through, and now he couldn't feel his body. Jerry was said to be practically decapitated the first time he woke up, with only the skin keeping his neck on his body. Now, I don't know a ton about, surgeries, the medical field, all of that, but from what I could tell, it was the fact that Jerry had bled too much during surgery, and to stop the bleeding, a jelly foam substance is often used. However, a ton of this substance was used inside of Jerry, and it kind of put pressure on his spine, causing him to practically be decapitated and also paralyzed. Other surgeons came in to help Jerry, and even though they saw that this jelly foam substance was used far too much, they also couldn't figure out how his vertebrae was unattached. It seemed as though it was purposely done. Now, another doctor had come in to try to help Jerry to keep him alive, and thankfully he could. But he was still paralyzed from the neck down. Jerry was obviously horrified, and he had a right to be. I mean, he was completely devastated. And at one point, he was pretty sad at first, like crying, not talking to anybody. But at one point, he started experiencing very strange behavior. And I'm sure, with such a difficult life change, this can happen. You can kind of have outbursts, you can have personality changes, but this was just very odd because a nurse would walk into his room to just kind of take care of him, and he would all of a sudden scream, "That's her. That's the nurse Christopher and I stayed up all night with, doing cocaine and having orgies the night before my surgery. We didn't sleep at all." And hearing this, the other doctors were baffled at the fact that their fellow surgeon, Christopher, might have operated under the influence. But of course, Jerry would actually take this back later on. Jerry was put in a wheelchair at this point. He had to be taken care of, and thankfully, the woman he was engaged with did take him in and took care of him, so he didn't have to go to any sort of home to get that help. She was really willing to help him. However, he really became a very sad, aggressive man because of what he had been through and the state he was in. And he was in this really heavy wheelchair, and he also started gaining a bunch of weight. And his fiance at the time said that he would actually ram into walls and just kind of try to take his aggression out on her for what had happened to him. And she said eventually she couldn't handle it anymore. She had bruises all over her body, and she had to move on and break up with him. Jerry never healed physically or mentally from what his best friend did to him. And Christopher wasn't punished for this at all. In fact, Christopher was suspended for about a month, but was able to join the staff once again after that month was over, and they recommended that he do drug tests, that he go and get some sort of treatment or addiction counseling, but he refused, and they still let him rejoin the staff. He was back in rooms with patients and operating tables and scalpels and knives and opening up these patients that had no idea what he had done before. Now, the next woman he would come in contact with was a woman named Kelly Martin, who was said to be the absolute nicest lady, elementary school teacher, loved to do things for other people, and she always made people smile. She had fallen off the ladder trying to get Christmas decorations, of course, from the attic, and she needed just a quick surgery to relieve some pain. She would find Christopher as a neurosurgeon and decide to go to him. He was very charming, he was very sweet, and she even asked him, "Have you had any surgeries that went wrong, or any, deaths or injuries, or, just trying to get a feel for how good he was or was not." She was really trying to do her research, but, talking to a doctor, how much are they really going to say about what they have done or the mistakes they have had in their past? And Christopher said no. Knock on wood, which if you don't know what that means, that's basically, trying to prevent it from happening. And so hearing that, Kelly felt comfortable going forward. And a surgery that was supposed to take less than an hour ended up taking 4. And Christopher would end up going out to her husband to tell him that they'd had some complications, but she was out of surgery now and she was fine. However, the nurses realized quickly that Kelly was not okay. Kelly was pale, she was breathing really heavily, was having a hard time doing so, and she would pass away soon after because there had been a major artery severed and she had bled to death internally. However, her family was at first told by Christopher that it was just an allergic reaction to the anesthesia. 2 surgeries, both patients either injured or dead. And this didn't seem like an accident or a coincidence, yet Christopher was saying it was just a medical miscalculation. But the only 2 surgeries he had done both had this happen. But there were actually many more clients before these 2 that we just talked about that Christopher had been involved in their surgeries and involved in harming them. Now, one was a man named Barry Morgaloff who had gone in to see Christopher, and he was just having some pain, and Christopher told him, if you see anything strange about me online, if, you see any bad reviews, you can always cancel, but if not, we'll continue on, and, you can choose if you trust me or not, which Barry thought was a strange thing, but he also didn't find any bad reviews online, so he continued. Now, another doctor would actually assist Christopher in this surgery. This doctor was being told by Christopher that there was a lot of inappropriate things happening in neurosurgery in the area, and that he was going to clean it all up. Little did this doctor know Christopher was going to do the opposite, and had already done the opposite of that. But when this doctor got into surgery, he was watching Christopher doing everything, and he noticed that he was doing everything the harder way. There's, always an easier way and then a harder way of going around things, and sometimes the harder way is necessary, but how Christopher was doing it was not the best way to do it, if that makes sense. So this doctor stopped him and said, look, if you're not going to do it right, I'll take over and I'll do it. And Christopher got really upset at this and refused, but this doctor wasn't, the main doctor in this surgery, so Christopher actually kicked him out, and he immediately went to the chief of surgery of the hospital to tell him what had happened and about Christopher, but Christopher still was not fired at this point. Barry woke up from his surgery feeling like he got hit by a truck, and a few weeks later his pain had actually worsened, and he went back to Christopher to see what was wrong, and Christopher told him that basically he needed another surgery. And Barry said, absolutely not. And he went back to a doctor that he had previously had to get a second opinion, because that doctor had told him he didn't even need surgery to begin with. Barry is actually now losing function on his left side completely, and it worsens every single day, and he has children that he can't even play with. Lee Passmore was the next victim that barely escaped death, and only realized this when he got paperwork to his job. You see, he worked at the medical examiner's office, and he had gotten a fax about a case that they were looking into of Kelly Martin. And they were looking into her death and suspicions surrounding the doctor, and that is when he would see the doctor's name. The same doctor that he had gone to for his own surgery. Thankfully enough, in Lee's case, the assistant doctor who was in with Christopher while doing Lee's surgery had stopped him completely and forced him to exit the room so he could take over. So that is why Lee actually had a good outcome. But there were many, many more patients turned victims, including Philip Mayfield, Kevin McNeil, Kenneth Fennell, and Jeff Cheney. They had all heard that Mr. Duntsch was this magical healer, and they were actually given the opposite results. Baylor Hospital had said at this point that he didn't meet the standard of care for a doctor, yet he continued to practice there for a while. However, eventually he was forced to resign, but they didn't fire him, meaning he could go on to other hospitals without saying he was fired at this one. Christopher would try to fight this resignation and them forcing him to do so by saying that Kelly's autopsy had basically said that it was a therapeutic misadventure of her cause of death, and that basically no foul play had occurred because it wasn't found in the autopsy, it wasn't written in the paperwork, so he had done nothing wrong. Although even though Baylor had basically kicked him out of their hospital, his name was not spread throughout the medical field saying that he was someone to look out for. Nobody knew who they were hiring when he started looking for jobs. And he would get a job at the Dallas Medical Center. And they looked, at all of his reviews and his Facebook page, who had incredible reviews on there. I think he had like a 4.5. And they actually talked to references from previous jobs he had had. And all of his previous coworkers and bosses were saying that he was great, that they had no problems with him, that he was a hard worker. So Dallas Medical Center said, "Sounds great, we need another neurosurgeon. You're hired." They granted him privileges that were restricted at first as being a new neurosurgeon, and this was still way more than he should have gotten. He was allowed to do 5 surgeries to just kind of see where he was at, how well he did. However, the first surgery that he did was successful. It was of a 71-year-old named Shirley Mock, who was a happy-go-lucky school administrator, and she said when she first met Christopher, she found him extremely charming. She survived the surgery, everything went fine, and she went on with her life. However, the second patient at this hospital wouldn't be so lucky. She was a 64-year-old woman named Floella Brown, and she had a lovely husband named Joe, who she had met in high school, and they were little lovebirds still together, and they had actually planned to retire together and move away. Joe had already done so, she was about to do it, and the only thing that they wanted to get done before they moved was a surgery for Floella to relieve her pain. So they decided to go to Christopher because they heard this new neurosurgeon was so good. So it was now July 24th of 2012, and she would go in for surgery. However, she would have a stroke due to a severed vertebral artery, and she would be put in intensive care, hanging on to her life. One day later, Christopher had another surgery, and this was of a woman named Mary Eford. And she would come out of surgery barely able to move her legs or her toes. She was in horrible condition and woke up screaming. And at this point, a doctor, a more experienced doctor named Dr. Robert Henderson, would come in to assist. Now, this was normal for Robert to be called in to assist on different cases. You know, some surgeons know more than others. Of course, they're more experienced. They can help out with different cases, so it's normal. However, it wasn't normal that administrators were calling Robert for help. The surgeons themselves normally did. However, Christopher didn't call him. The administrators at Dallas Medical Center did. So he got there, and that is when he realized who the doctor was. And he started to kind of remember all of the rumors he had been hearing around at different hospitals through the staff. And he realized that one of those rumors were coming true right in front of him. Robert looked over the x-rays of Mary Eford, and there were also notes that Christopher had made about her surgery, what he was going to do right before they went in. And Robert looked at all these notes. They were perfectly fine. They were exactly what he should have done. However, looking at the x-rays, it didn't match because nothing he said he was going to do is what he actually did in her surgery. It was like the exact opposite. And Robert even said that the work on Mary Eford looked like it was a child playing with Tinker Toys. Mary actually had surgical hardware left in her back muscles, which of course were going to cause her so much pain. But his previous patient at the hospital, Floella Brown, she wasn't doing so well. And there is actually a bit more to her story than just, having a good surgery and coming out to the other side so horrible. And it was said that in the operating room, Christopher had started saying that there was a lot of blood and he couldn't see, and he was asking for the nurses, in there to help because he couldn't see anything to do the procedure. He wasn't wrong, he wasn't lying, there was blood everywhere covering everything, but she did come out of surgery at first and she appeared fine. The only thing she asked for was some ice, and that was it. She really seemed to be doing well. However, when her husband Joe came to visit her, he said something was wrong. Something that, nurses and doctors wouldn't be able to see if they didn't really know Floella. And that was that she seemed really fidgety, and she's never like that any other time. Joe knew something was wrong, and the next morning, she would end up having a stroke. This was also the day of Mary Eford's surgery, and Christopher was supposed to be there to check on Floella, but also to start Mary's surgery. And he was supposed to be there at 7. However, he didn't get there till about an hour later, and he also had 2 days worth of stubble on his face. He had pupils that were extremely small, and he also had a hole in his scrubs on his buttocks. And the thing was, That was strange to begin with because scrubs are supposed to be in excellent condition for these surgeries. But it was even more strange because the doctors who had been watching him had noticed he had had a hole in his scrubs for the last 3 days. He hadn't changed them. To go into surgery and to just not change, not wash them is a really bad thing as a doctor. While beginning Mary's surgery, Christopher actually was so fixated on Floella and her condition and talking about her, and he wanted to try this new surgery, and the nurses in there were saying, we don't have the equipment for that, we can't do that, and he was getting really angry. And the nurse actually went out to talk to, someone above them about if they could do the surgery, if they had the equipment, all of that, and then they came back in saying, no, you cannot do it. And Christopher actually got so upset that he left the room with Mary Euphra's body open. Where he was working on her was just open on the operating table, and he left the room for 15 minutes to talk about Floella's possible surgery in the future. Now, the new doctor who came to assist, Robert Henderson, had come, and he had taken Mary back into surgery to try to help relieve some of this pain she was having, and he actually found that a screw was just basically going around in her spine, hitting her in different ways. It was loose, and the damage inside from Christopher's surgery was baffling. In fact, he had been working in the wrong area. It wasn't even the same area that was supposed to help Mary. And Robert started to believe that everything done wrong was done on purpose. Now, 2 more patients were in critical condition, and almost every surgery he had done had ended horribly. But why? He was said to get incredible grades in school. He had hours of schooling under different surgeons doing all of these surgeries. So how is this possible? He wrote in his notes exactly what he was going to do, and it didn't transfer to the operating table at all. No one really knew at this point, but Dr. Robert Henderson was not letting this go. Floella would actually pass away soon after, and she was taken off of life support because no brain activity was found. Mary had survived but was now paralyzed, and Robert now made it his mission to do something about Christopher. Dallas Medical Center had forced him to resign after only 3 of his 5 surgeries had been done. However, it didn't mean that he had to stop practicing. It didn't mean that he couldn't just go to another hospital and get a job, which is exactly what he would do next. In fact, do you remember the patient that I told you was actually a success, Shirley Mock? Well, it turned out that she actually wasn't. She would come back in and she would be saying that she was in pain again, and this was for kind of a checkup, and he would take x-rays of her and find that she had basically bone and metal fragments just moving around inside of her, and he started to blame her, saying, you fell. You're the problem for all of this. This happened because you fell. She was saying, no, I did not fall. I know I did not fall. I don't know what you're talking about. He said she needed emergency surgery, but he was going to be doing it at a different hospital because, of course, he had been forced to resign at the first one. And so she did. She went under this surgery, and it took 6 hours and a blood transfusion, and she woke up screaming in pain. She did survive. I'm not sure if she was paralyzed, but I know that she did survive. But that's not something that we can say for all of these victims. His new job would be at a place called the Legacy Surgery Center, but he wasn't there for long before he had to move to the University General Hospital. And there Christopher would meet another patient, and that would be a man named Jeff Glidewell. And he would end up paralyzing Jeff, his vocal cord, one of them, and he also attached his esophagus to his trachea when he shouldn't have been anywhere near that area at all, and he was supposed to be working on his spine. When Jeff was actually opened up by another doctor to see what Christopher had done, why he was still in all this pain, he said that the work of Christopher was done by someone who was a crazed maniac who was trying to kill Jeff. He had one vocal cord left, was paralyzed on his left side. It was actually found that Christopher wouldn't stop performing this surgery on Jeff, even though all of the nurses were saying, you're not doing it right, something's wrong. Like, they found all this oddities at this first time he was doing a surgery at this new hospital, and they had to restrain him to get him to stop. He was still performing surgeries, but Dr. Robert Henderson was not giving up on his fight to finish him in the medical field. And so he started to call people of Christopher's past and to see if he had really even gone to medical school, because at this point Robert was saying, I'm not even sure that he's a real surgeon or that he even went to school. I think that he's a fraud. However, he would start calling and he would find out that Christopher had gone to school. He did well, but he also was known more for drinking and doing drugs and partying than studying. In fact, in his residency program, he was actually found to be suspected to be under the influence of cocaine, and he was put into a physician's impaired program, but after he was done with that, he could be put back into residency. What Robert did find was that he hadn't gotten a doctorate in microbiology at St. Jude because that program hadn't existed when he said he went there. So that was one crack in the story that he found that just wasn't quite adding up. You know, his friends would say that he was pretty volatile, but more a competitor than a fighter, but he was also very forgetful, like extremely forgetful, and had a terrible sense of direction, so much so that his friends often kind of had to do the little tasks for him, like driving him around, cleaning his room, organizing his stuff, or he wouldn't have graduated school. Eventually, finding everything that he could about Christopher, Robert went to the Texas Medical Board to get them to suspend Christopher's medical license, and they would actually do so and revoke it on December 6th of 2013. Now, this was great news for all of the possible patients he could have come in contact with. So he decided to move to Denver with his parents at this time, and it was a really bad time for Christopher. He started showing the world a different side of him that only his patients really got to see. One that he couldn't cover up by saying they were just medical accidents. And these were things like being arrested for a DUI, being sent to a psychiatric evaluation when he went to visit his children, and also stealing things from Walmart like sunglasses and cologne and keyboards and just the most random things that weren't necessities. It wasn't like he was unemployed and didn't have the money. It was just random things that he wanted to steal. He was also found wandering the streets, and the next year, the previous patients that he had had who hadn't just settled wanted to go after him and get something, some sort of justice from him. They knew that they would be more likely to get money out of the very hospitals that he had worked at, so they went after them. And you know, unfortunately, many of these victims had already settled with these hospitals because they were told, you know, it's going to cost you a lot of money. We have a lot of money, but you don't. So why don't we just give you some money and you settle with that? And then we end all of this. So unfortunately, a lot of them had already done so, and it just covered enough to, you know, cover their medical bills, and that was pretty much it. However, some had refused to do this, and that was Mary Eford, Kenneth Fennell, and Lee Passmore, who were saying that he was a dangerous physician and they had employed him knowing that. Dr. Robert Henderson was not taking this as the final stand for justice. He wanted to go after Christopher himself. He wanted criminal charges pressed against him, and it was now 2015, meaning that the statute of limitations was about to run out on most of these cases, so they needed to do it quickly, and prosecutors started to interview many of his patients and the patients' families, basically to get a feel for what they were going through to find his actions criminal or not. After talking to most of them, they knew that what they had gone through was horrific enough to call it criminal. Prosecutors also found an email that was sent to his colleague, which turned out to be his mistress named Kim, back in 2011, and it was quite strange and very concerning. This email said, "Anyone close to me thinks that I am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist, because how can I do anything I want and cross every discipline boundary like it's a playground and never lose? I'm ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer. The sad fact is that I would go faster, do better, and catch more respect and honor by effing everyone in the brain, emotionally and mentally controlling them in a manner that borders on abuse, taking no prisoners and sending everyone in my way, and especially that F's with me, to hell." That's an actual email he wrote a year into practicing medicine and doing these surgeries. Another email was found to Kim that said, "Where I come from, I rule the effing world and crushed every effing thing that looked at me twice and was always hidden and behind the scenes." Now, after Kelly Martin had actually died in the hospital from Christopher's surgery, Kim actually left her job and broke up with him and was not wanting anything to do with him because she really believed he was this monster, and he actually didn't take this well and started harassing her, banging on her window, and wouldn't leave her alone. That July, Christopher would finally be arrested for 6 felony counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, as in his hands and the surgical tools that he was using, as well as 5 counts of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury and 1 count of injury to an elderly person. That 1 count for an elderly person was for Mary Uford, and they truly believed that they could get the longest sentence for him if they really focused on Mary's case. He could get life for it. Christopher's defense started going on and on about he didn't know how bad of a job he had done, and that he had poor training, and he wasn't controlled by the hospitals. It was all their fault. He wasn't trained properly by his schools, and it wasn't his fault that he harmed so many people. 31 out of his 38 patients had been paralyzed by his hands, and 2 of which had died. Yet he told everyone that this wasn't preventable. Now, this whole arrest and trial came at the perfect time too, because he had said that he was trying to obtain a medical license in a different state. Mary Uford would testify against him, and she was crying, and she was saying she had suffered so much depression from what he had done to her and how it had affected her life. And Jerry Summers actually testified from his own home because he is so paralyzed that it's hard for him to move. He's in pain, and he is much more comfortable there, so they actually just video chatted with him. And he was saying that Christopher had only visited him once a few years after the surgery and didn't really seem to care about what he did to him. It also came out that Christopher always used drugs while performing these surgeries because he called them neurostimulators and said that it made him a better surgeon. After 13 days of the trial and 4 hours in jury deliberation, he was found guilty of maiming Mary Uford and was sentenced to life. All 4 hospitals he worked at have ongoing civil cases against them. Now, Christopher's case is actually one of the first prison sentences given for malpractice. And this, of course, is going to give a huge start to giving victims justice who have dealt with negligent doctors. A director of neurosurgery said, "The only way this happens is that the entire system fails the patients," which I would say is 100% true. He shouldn't have gone through any of this. He shouldn't have been let through schooling. He shouldn't have been hired. Those people shouldn't have been references for him and said that he was great and covered up the bad parts of how he was and what he did. I mean, that made it difficult for these new hospitals to look past those positive references and see what he was lacking, so they did hire him. And what about the staff in the operating rooms with him? I know that they only have a small voice, but why didn't they speak up more, gather together and go to their boss saying, look, something needs to be done, something is very wrong? Why didn't they speak up? You know that they were talking about it and it was rumored, but why weren't they talking to someone higher? Did they not think they could because they believed he was this incredible neurosurgeon that was far above them and no one would listen to them? And in that case, that needs to be changed too, because those are the people that have to work side by side with them. So if they see something wrong, they should be listened to too. Why did it take dozens of doctors working with him for one to finally say this is not going to continue? For Robert Henderson to say something is seriously wrong? These are questions I think that we need to be working towards the answers to as a whole society. I mean, I think that the medical industry is so incredibly important, and so we need to be doing our best to make sure that we're not letting people who don't deserve to be in it slip by. I just want to say, I'm not by any means saying that all doctors are negligent or that most of them are, or that you should be paranoid about your doctors, but I just think, like in any industry, there's good and there's bad, and this was a really, really bad one, and it just makes you more aware going into these situations that just because they have a doctor's coat on, or they have, a name tag and a PhD, it doesn't make them angels. It doesn't make them perfect humans. They might be, but they might not. So you kind of have to judge that for yourself. You have to do the research, in-depth research, before you are willing to trust these people with your life. On the same token, you need to be very grateful for the ones that are angels, the ones that do help and risk their own lives in helping, and we need to definitely give them more credit for what they do every single day and treat them much better than I've seen different patients treat their nurses and their doctors. So, yeah, I hope this was interesting to you. I know that it was quite different than what I normally do, but I did still feel like the people who had gone through so much, and of course the two that passed away, deserve their stories to be told, and I think it is just, a cautionary tale that we all need to hear. So yeah, I hope you guys are doing well and staying extremely safe, staying inside. It's not worth it to go out. It is only for necessities that you should be out, and I really hope that you are following all of the proper rules. I know that you guys are wonderful who watch me, but I hope that you spread it to the people who are around you that aren't listening, that it is necessary, and it's the only way we're going to get through this is if we all work together. So yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.